beaten for being barren. She was sold, until a silent rancher paid, every dime. He had the rope cut into her wrists as if to remind her of what she already knew, that she was bound, owned, and humiliated before the eyes of men who never once saw her as human. Ruth staggered when they shoved her onto the platform, her bare feet sliding against splintered boards. She tasted iron in her mouth where the last blow had split her lip, and the sting of shame burned hotter than the desert. Sun pressing down on her shoulders. "Barren," one man called, his voice thick with scorn. "Not worth more'n a mule too old to pull." Laughter flared, crude and eager. Ruth's eyes drifted past them to the far line of the prairie. Out there, the land stretched in waves of dust and grass, open enough to swallow a woman whole. She wished it would. But instead she stood shackled, the property of her husband no longer, because he had found no use for a wife who couldn't swell with children. So he sold her, piece by piece, with words sharper than spurs, until only this remained. "Let's start the bidding," the auctioneer barked, sweat glistening at his temple. He clapped his hands and grinned like he was offering a fine prize. Strong enough for chores, quiet enough not to argue, a woman with nowhere else to go. Ruth fixed her gaze on a knot in the beam above the crowd. If she stared hard enough, she could almost pretend the knot was an eye of God, watchful, unblinking, refusing to turn away. Around her, dust floated in the heat like bits of burnt prayer. Bids flew like arrows. 2 men argued, each driving her price higher. They laughed about what they might do with her in their houses, how their children could use her as a scullery. Maid. Someone whistled. Someone spat. Ruth's face stayed still, though her wrists throbbed and the rope burned her skin. "Can she cook?" a voice shouted. "She can work," the auctioneer said, "and that's all that matters." Ruth closed her eyes, holding fast against the rising tide of embarrassment, against the memory of nights spent begging God for a cry that never came, months measured by silence. Hope turned to ash. The jeers faded to a far-off wind. She pictured the cottonwoods by the river beyond town, how their leaves trembled like small green hands. She pictured water moving over stones without asking permission. Then the air changed. Silence fell, not soft but heavy, as if the whole street were holding its breath. Even the horses at the hitching posts shifted and stilled. A man had stepped forward at the back of the crowd. He moved with the slow certainty of someone who had already decided. His hat shadowed his face, but his frame was broad, his boots scuffed with miles of trail dust. He didn't speak. He simply set a heavy pouch of coins into the auctioneer's hand. "That's every dime he had," someone whispered, astonished. The auctioneer blinked, pinched the pouch between thick fingers, then gave a crooked laugh. "Sold." His gavel slammed against the post, and the sound rang in Ruth's bones like the crack of a whip. The man climbed the steps. Up close, his silence settled around him like a coat. His hands were rough, calloused from work, but gentle as he cut the rope. The fibers fell away, leaving angry red rings on Ruth's wrists. She flinched, expecting the next command, the next insult. None came. He met her gaze with eyes that startled her, gray as a storm bank, steady, unreadable. He tipped. His hat once, a simple courtesy stripped of flourish. When Ruth swayed, he offered his arm. "Fool of a rancher," someone muttered behind them. "All that silver for a barren woman." Heat climbed Ruth's neck, but she took the stranger's arm because it was the only solid thing left between her and the emptiness below. The crowd parted like brush before a fire. Dust swirled around their boots as they crossed the street. He led her to a waiting horse, a strong bay mare with honest eyes. With that same quiet certainty, he lifted Ruth onto the saddle. He swung up behind her, arms a respectful distance yet ready, as if he understood how a body might flinch after too much harm. His silence didn't feel cruel. It felt deliberate, like he saved his words for things that mattered. They rode out under the white glare of noon, past the gallows of telegraph poles, past waspish storefronts with their peeling paint, past boys who stared and men who wouldn't meet Ruth's eyes. The town shrank behind them until only hooves and wind remained. The planes opened, breathing them in, sage and sun and a sky so large it seemed to press the world flat. Ruth's fear didn't vanish, it loosened. The stranger's body heat at her back was steady but not possessive. His hand at the reins was sure. A hawk circled high. A line of antelope flickered along a distant ridge. The mare's ears twitched to flies, and the rhythm of her gait settled into Ruth's bones like a metronome, reminding her of life's ordinary beats. She licked cracked lips. "Why?" she whispered, voice hoarse as a corn husk. He didn't answer. The only reply was leather creaking and the patient chuff of the mare. After a time, his arm tightened just enough to brace Ruth as the horse navigated a washout, steadying her with ease. He was a man built for long distances, she thought, for weather and work and keeping his counsel. The day tilted toward afternoon. Out here, the sun did not simply move. It judged. Ruth felt its gaze on every bruise, every secret. She studied. The land for anything to anchor herself. A wind-stunted juniper, a fence half-eaten by rust, a blue thread of water glimmering across a hollow. When they reached that creek, the rancher drew rein and swung down. He offered his hand. Ruth slid from the saddle, legs trembling. He led the mare to drink, then filled a dented tin cup and brought it to Ruth. "Thank you," she murmured, surprised at how the words cracked like dry twigs. He nodded. "No more." She cupped the water with both hands, drinking slow, feeling it, cool the fire in her. The creek's song was small but insistent, a string of silver notes laid over stones. Birds chatted in the scrub, a cricket rasped from the grass. The world, which had been nothing but jeers and ropes and the sour breath of men, widened to let in sound again. Ruth glanced at her wrists. The rope burns were angry tracks. The man, her buyer, her rescuer, her unknown, pulled a clean strip of cloth from his saddlebag and offered it to her. She hesitated. He waited. She wrapped her wrists herself, clumsy but determined. He watched without intruding, that storm-gray gaze seeing every detail and judging none of it. "Do you—" she began, then stopped. What could she ask? His name? His reasons? What would either answer change? He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat as if to say, "Later," or perhaps when it matters. They rode on, following the creek until it climbed into a shallow slope of pasture. Ahead, on a rise baked the color of old bread, a small ranch squared itself against the wind, a weather-gray house with a lean porch, a corral mended a dozen times, a barn with a stubborn lean but good bones, a kitchen garden gone to seed. A single cottonwood stood by the well, leaves ticking like a clock. This was a homestead that had known hands and hurt both. Ruth recognized the set of it as one recognizes a scar. She felt the old ache in her chest, the wanting that had nowhere to land. The wanting didn't diminish because of what the world had said she couldn't give. It deepened, but it turned. It became a wanting to mend what was broken in any way she could. The rancher swung down first and tied the mare to the rail. When Ruth slid to the ground, her knees buckled. He steadied her by the elbow, then let go promptly, as if careful not to make a claim he had not earned. He motioned toward the porch, and together they climbed the steps. On the threshold he paused, took off his hat, and finally spoke. "Jonah," he said, one word low as thunder far off. Ruth swallowed. "Ruth." "Welcome," he added, and that was all. But the word hung in the shaded air like a lantern lit, small and sufficient. Inside, the house was spare and clean, the rooms lined with the kind of quiet that comes from years of talking only to weather and animals. A quilt worn to softness lay folded on a cedar chest. On the table, a single tin plate and a coffee cup. On the shelf, a Bible whose leather had been read to a shine. By the door, a pair of small boots, child-sized, carefully mended. Ruth looked at them the way one looks at a graveside. Jonah's jaw tightened, a flick of pain across a still lake, then smoothed again. Ruth didn't ask. He didn't explain. 2 lives stood in that room, both hollowed in places the other could not yet. See? Between them stretched a length of afternoon and a future neither had planned. The floorboards creaked like old bones learning a new step. Outside, wind slid its hand through the cottonwood leaves until they answered with a soft applause. Jonah set water to heat, sliced bread without flourish, pushed half toward her and sat. Ruth ate slowly, tasting salt and flour, and the quiet answer of a man who had parted with everything he had not to own her, but to unbind her. When she finally set the cup down, the last of her shaking eased. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Work, certainly. Judgment, undoubtedly. But the gray-eyed man across the table had chosen silence where others chose cruelty. That felt like a door cracked open in a dark house. Ruth lifted her bandaged wrists, felt the pulse steady there, and let herself breathe. Ruth woke to the sound of horses snorting in the corral and the low creak of the windmill outside. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Her body braced for the sting of orders barked, fists raised. Then she saw the wooden rafters overhead. The quilt tucked carefully to her chin and the smell of coffee drifting from the next room. She closed her eyes again, trying to let the realization sink in. No one was coming to drag her by the hair. No voice was shouting her name in anger. She sat up, stiff in every joint, and wrapped her arms around her knees. This wasn't freedom. Not yet. She was still a woman bought at an auction block, a barren wife traded like cattle. But something was different here. Jonah's silence had done what no kindness could have managed. It had given her space, a pocket of air big enough to breathe without choking. When she stepped into the kitchen, Jonah was already there, sleeves rolled to his elbows, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He nodded once, a gesture neither demanding nor dismissive, and pushed a cup toward her place at the table. "Thank you," Ruth murmured. Her voice was soft, uncertain. Jonah only inclined his head, then sat across from her, breaking his bread in quiet pieces. His eyes didn't linger on her bruises, nor on the raw bands around her wrists. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the prairie wake, the sway of grass, the hawk lifting from the fence post, the stubborn sun pushing through clouds. The silence was strange, but it wasn't empty. Ruth had known silences like locked doors, heavy with punishment. This was different. This silence seemed to say, "Take your time." After breakfast, Jonah stood, picked up his hat, and motioned for her to follow. They stepped out into the dry morning air, crisp with sage and dust. The ranch stretched wide around them. Weathered fences, a barn leaning like an old man but standing still, the corral where 3 horses shifted restlessly, and fields gone ragged from neglect. Jonah pointed to the barn, then to the trough, then back to the horses. Ruth understood. He didn't need words to say it. Chores came first. She nodded, grateful for something her hands could do. All morning they worked side by side. Ruth hauled buckets, scattering feed for the chickens that scurried with frantic hunger. Jonah patched fence posts, his hammer steady and unhurried. When he lifted the water barrels, Ruth caught the taut pull of his shoulders, the set of a man, who carried both weight and sorrow without complaint. By midday, her palms were blistered, but the ache steadied her nerves. Work was different here. It wasn't punishment or proof of worth. It was survival, plain and simple. Jonah finally paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "You done fine," he said, voice low as if unused. Ruth blinked. Those were the first words. He'd spoken since yesterday's welcome. They sank into her chest like water to dry soil. She almost answered, but her throat closed. Instead, she only nodded, holding his gaze a second longer than before. They ate lunch on the porch. Plates, balanced on their laps. A soft wind rustled the cottonwood, its leaves whispering above them like prayers said under breath. Ruth watched Jonah's profile, his square jaw, the scar just under his ear, the way he kept his hat brim pulled low as if the world demanded too much from his eyes. "Why did you buy me?" she asked finally, the question she hadn't dared repeat since the road. Jonah didn't answer right away. He chewed his bread, swallowed, and leaned back against the post. When he spoke, his words were measured, as though he only spent them when they mattered most. No one deserves to be sold. That was all. Yet the plainness of it struck her harder than any scripture or sermon. He hadn't saved her because he needed a wife or because he wanted payment for labor. He'd done it because something in him refused to stand by. Ruth turned her eyes to the fields, overgrown with weeds, the soil cracked and thirsting for rain. A place abandoned, yet still, capable of life. In that moment she felt the kinship between herself and the land, both written off as barren, both waiting for a chance to prove otherwise. That night she lay awake on her narrow bed, listening to the coyotes cry in the distance and the steady creak of the windmill turning. Jonah had given her no promises, no declarations. But in his silence she sensed the possibility of something she had long been denied: dignity, and maybe, just maybe, a future that could be her own. The garden behind the ranch house was a tangle of weeds and thistles, the soil hard-packed as if it had forgotten the touch of a seed. Ruth stood at its edge with a hoe in hand, staring at the wild patch. The morning sun painted the horizon gold, and for the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her that wasn't fear. "This ground," she whispered to herself, "ain't any deader than I've been told I am." Jonah, hammering a loose hinge on the barn door, glanced over at her. He didn't interrupt, didn't question why she was talking to dirt as though it might answer. He only tipped his hat and went back to his work. So Ruth set the hoe to the soil. Each strike jarred her arms, but she kept at it, sweat trickling down her temple. The ground yielded slow, grudging, but with every clump of earth loosened, she felt a strange defiance building. If they had called her barren, then here was her answer. She would coax life from this patch of forgotten ground. Days turned into weeks. She scavenged seeds from Jonah's pantry, beans, corn, a packet of wilted lettuce he hadn't thought worth planting. She kneaded the soil like bread dough, watered sparingly from the creek, and knelt until her knees were raw. Jonah watched. From a distance, sometimes pausing in his work to hand her a bucket or build a crude fence against rabbits. He never told her it was hopeless. His silence was permission enough. By late spring, green shoots broke through. Ruth nearly cried when she saw them, her hands trembling over the fragile stems. She pressed her palms together, whispering thanks into the wind. Life, small and stubborn, had dared to appear where no one expected it. The ranch itself began to change with her. She mended the torn curtains, scrubbed the floors until the wood shone, patched Jonah's shirts with careful stitches. It wasn't servitude, it was claiming space. Each small act said, "I belong here too." One evening, Jonah came in from the fields with his shirt darkened by sweat. Ruth ladled stew into 2 bowls, the scent of onion and wild herbs filling the cabin. He sat across from her, tired but steady. For a while they ate in silence. Then Jonah's voice broke the stillness. "My wife used to keep a garden," he said. His tone carried no bitterness, only memory. Ruth set her spoon down carefully. "She's gone?" Jonah nodded. "Fever." Took her and the boy both. His jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed fixed on the table. The words hung heavy, and Ruth understood why those small boots by the door had been left untouched. She wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but words felt clumsy against a wound that deep. Instead, she reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over his. For a moment, he did not move. Then his rough fingers closed gently around hers. It was the first time she felt warmth pass between them without fear riding alongside it. The garden grew taller, and with it grew Ruth's courage. She began humming while she worked, soft tunes she remembered from her mother's kitchen. Jonah would pause in his chores, listening without letting on, though the faintest curve touched his lips. One evening, a storm rolled over the plains, black clouds swallowing the horizon. Ruth rushed outside, fighting the wind to shield her tender plants with canvas. Jonah joined her, holding the posts steady as rain pelted down. They worked shoulder to shoulder, mud streaking their faces until the storm passed. When the clouds broke, a rainbow arched faint and fragile above the ranch. Ruth stood breathless, soaked, her laughter ringing across the fields. Jonah looked at her then, not with pity, but with something like awe. In that moment, Ruth realized she was no longer the woman dragged to an auction block, beaten and unwanted. She was a woman who had made the earth yield, who had steadied another's. Grief without flinching, she was at last becoming whole. By midsummer, the corn stood shoulder high, tassels whispering like gossip in the afternoon wind. Ruth kept a small notebook tucked into her apron, rows of penciled dates, rainfall marks, sketches of rows she meant to widen come fall. In the margins, she wrote the words she did not speak: hold fast. Grow anyway. 2 children had begun to wander over most mornings from the Hales homestead a mile east. Bee with her missing front tooth, and little Sam dragging a wooden horse on a string. Their mother, Miriam, was expecting again and moved, slow as August. Ruth split biscuits, slipped apricot jam between layers, and set them on the porch rail for small hands. The children grew used to the gentle pat of Ruth's palm on their heads, to Jonah's careful, mind the fence now, as though the ranch were a world that would hold them if they didn't quite know how to hold themselves. That quiet felt like a miracle, which is perhaps why the sound of riders coming fast rang in Ruth's nerves like a pan dropped on plank boards. 3 men loped into the yard at a mean trot, dust rising rope-thick behind them. The one in front had a hat creased, cruel as a sneer, and eyes like hot nails. Ruth knew the set of his shoulders before his face was close enough to know. Harlan Cole reined in at the pump and smiled like a knife. "Well, look what took root," he said, gaze skimming Ruth's figure as if pricing a mule. "Didn't think I'd be missing the pleasure of your company, Ruth." Jonah stepped out of the barn with a halter looped over one wrist, the curve of his jaw gone iron. He stopped 1 step ahead of Ruth without touching her. Harlan's boys, Tucker Vale, Mean to the Marrow, and Jeb Pike, grin loose as a hinge, snickered. Tucker's eyes went to the garden. "Barren ground bearing weeds," he said. "Seems fitting." Ruth felt heat climb her throat, but kept her hands still at her sides. She had learned at last that stillness could be its own kind of blade. "What do you want?" Jonah's voice had the weight of river stones. "Property," Harlan said, flicking dust from his sleeve. "You took mine. I've come to square accounts." "Ruth isn't property," Jonah said. "She's my wife." Harlan answered easy. "What I sell I can claim again if the sale wasn't clean. That auction was a joke. Ante up, the boys laughed, and I had a mind to make a point. Didn't reckon you'd be fool enough to throw real silver. Sheriff says it smelled wrong. Banker. 2. Ruth's heartbeat stumbled. "Sheriff?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "Pritchard at the bank says this place is shy on taxes now that your hero emptied his pockets." Harlan's smile widened. Funny thing, the law likes a ledger to balance. Ledger says Jonah owes. Ledger says I can file to levy what he's got if I show harm done. Maybe I take your water rights. Maybe I take those fence lines you're so proud of. Maybe I take you back and stop being generous. Jonah's hand tightened once at his side. Get off my land. Soon enough, Harlan said easily. But here's my line in the dust. I'll be back in a week with paper and a deputy. You sign over the east pasture and right to draw from the creek come August, and I let your... He tipped his chin toward Ruth. Charity project keep playing house. Or you don't, and I collect in other ways. You know how that goes. He tugged his reins. As he turned, his gaze cut Ruth. Pretty notebook, Ruth, he said, eyes on the corner peeking from her apron. You write down all the months God said no? He clucked to his horse and laughed when she did not flinch. Dust swallowed them as they rode out, the sound of their hooves a hammer in Ruth's chest long after they were gone. Jonah said nothing. He didn't have to. Ruth already saw the figures marching in his mind. Seed purchased and taxes due, fence wire and a man's last silver lying inside an auctioneer's hand. She swallowed against the old shame rising like bile. This is because of me, she said. No, Jonah said, and the word seemed to steady on the porch rail, a nail driven true. This is because men like Harlan think people are columns, in a book. He turned his head and finally let his eyes meet hers. You're not a debt. The rest of the day, Ruth worked twice as hard, as if motion could drown the voice in her that whispered, maybe you should go back to spare him. She pulled water until the skin on her palms went glassy with new blisters. She stitched the sagging, feed sacks closed with tight, neat mends. In the house that night, she took her notebook and wrote a letter she didn't show Jonah, a letter to Pritchard the banker in a hand steady as a plow line. If the land holds through harvest, we can meet. What's due? Let the garden speak before you tally a life. She folded it into an envelope she'd saved from flour, licked it shut, and set it under the Bible on the shelf. In town next day, the store was a hive humming with its usual mercies and meannesses. Mrs. Avery gave Ruth a sack of coffee with a look that held both pity and admiration. Folks talk, she said softly. Let them. Weather's worse. Outside, Tucker Vale leaned against the post and spat tobacco close to Ruth's skirt hem. Tell your quiet man to make peace while he can, he drawled. Water runs downhill, and so does luck. When Ruth and Jonah rolled back across the flats, they found the south fence slashed and 6 steers gone. Tracks led east, 3 riders and a drag of hooves. Jonah knelt, jaw clenched, then rose without a word. They patched until starlight with only the whip stitch of crickets for company. Ruth's hands bled through their bandages. When she reached the last post, Jonah took the hammer from her. Enough, he said. In the days that followed, the ranch acquired a new kind of quiet, taut as a wire in frost. The pregnant bay mare started pacing the corral, sides rippling with the foals, restless kicks. The children still came by each morning, Bee's sunburned nose peeled, little Sam carrying a jar to collect grasshoppers for the hens. Ruth pressed an extra biscuit into each small palm and felt the strange ache of responsibility wedged against, her sternum like a hidden blade. On the 6th evening, a red smear appeared at the horizon. Ruth was kneeling by the beans, checking for cutworms, when the stink reached her. Smoke, not of kitchen wood, but of sage and cheatgrass, of something that ran and scoured as it burned. She stood so fast she dropped her bucket. Wind came hard, from the east, shoving heat like a hand. "Jonah!" she called. He was already on the porch, eyes cutting to the smear that had become a wall. "Grass fire, fast as sin when the wind got under it. Too far to be accident." Harlan's men had ridden east that afternoon, laughing. Jonah moved like a man who had done this dance before. "We cut a line by the dry wash," he said, voice low. "Soak the roof. wet burlap on the rails. He looked, once, at Ruth, and she saw the calculus in his gaze: garden or house, fence or barn, what to let go to save what could be saved. Ruth grabbed the pump handle and worked until the corded muscles in her arms burned. She soaked blankets and flung them over the porch rails. She sloshed water at the base of the cottonwood, at the stacked woodpile, at the chicken coop, every place a stray ember might kiss and claim. The fire came like a thing with legs, skittering, leaping, hissing where it found sage. The sky browned. Ash began to fall, soft and obscene as confetti. Chickens screamed. The mare screamed louder, a high, wild sound that knifed Ruth to the bone. "Pen her behind the barn," Jonah shouted through his bandana. "If she bolts, we lose her." Ruth ran for the corral. The mare's eyes showed white. Foam fretted her bit. Ruth climbed the rail and slid in slow, hands out, voice low. "Hush now, girl, hush." Her own breath came in bursts, but she kept, the tone of lullaby tied to her words. The mare's ears flicked to her. Ruth touched the damp neck, felt trembling under her palm, and eased the halter up. "With me," she said, and somehow the mare listened, stepping light, trusting the narrow circle of Ruth's calm. Behind the barn, Jonah was swinging a flapper of wet gunny sack, beating sparks from the air. The fire leaned toward them, greedy, as if sniffing the new cut line and daring it to hold. Heat pressed so strong Ruth's eyes watered. She blinked and saw in one terrible clear frame the garden she had coaxed to life, the modest house that had taught her the size of a man's mercy, the small boots by the door, the notebook with its soft pencil please. "Maybe I go back," the old thought whispered. "Maybe I trade myself for all of this." She straightened, and the thought slid away. She had been traded enough. "Jonah," she called over the hiss and roar. "Take the house. I'll hold the line." He started to argue, then saw her face and didn't. He trusted her with the fire the way he had trusted her with silence. He ran for the porch. Ruth planted her feet in dust gone to paste with the water they'd thrown, and swung the wet burlap until her shoulders shrieked. The line flickered and faltered. Embers leaped the wash like foxes. Ruth stamped them with the last of the water, in her bucket and with her own hands when she had to, breath tearing in her chest. Across the yard, Bee and little Sam appeared at the fence, eyes huge, thin voices calling Ruth's name. Miriam must have sent them running ahead while she packed what she could. Ruth's heart punched her ribs. "Back to the road," she shouted, pointing, fierce. "Take the cart path. Keep low." She leaped the rail, grabbed each small wrist long enough to press them toward the track that canted west. "Run!" They ran. When Ruth turned back, the fire had found a snag of dead scrub and lifted into a column, a thing all teeth. Ash swirled. The mare shrilled again and went to her knees. Ruth dropped beside her, hands to the sweat-slicked neck, and felt the first hard ripple of a contraction under her palm. The bay was going to fold, now with the world trying to burn down around them. Ruth looked once at the red wall hunting, across Jonah's land, once at the animal whose life had learned her quiet, and once toward the house where Jonah moved like a dark stitch between flame and shelter. Then she rolled her sleeves higher, set her jaw, and chose. The mare's muscles rippled and seized, her body slick with sweat and ash. Ruth knelt in the dirt beside her, skirts plastered to her legs, eyes stinging from smoke. She had no midwife's hands, no training beyond memory, her mother once steadying. A birthing cow, her own young hands pressed against warm hide. But instinct rose where fear tried to drown her. She pressed her palm to the mare's flank. "You're not alone," she whispered, voice raw but steady. "We'll see it through, you and me." The fire pressed closer, roaring like 1,000 voices. Sparks spat across the wash, but the dampened line Jonah had cut held, barely. Ruth bent her body over the mare's, shielding her eyes from the smoke. When the foal's hooves showed, slick and trembling, Ruth gritted her teeth and pulled with a strength born of something deeper than flesh. The foal slid free into her arms, a miracle of legs and breath. Ruth cleared its nostrils with shaking fingers, rubbed its chest with her apron until it gave a ragged, desperate gasp. It coughed, then wailed, thin, high, alive. Ruth laughed, half sobbing, pressing her forehead to its damp coat. See? Life, where no one believed it. Behind her, Jonah's shout broke through the din. She turned to see him beating sparks from the porch roof, his silhouette cut against a sky gone red. When his eyes found her, kneeling with a new foal struggling to its feet, something in his face changed. He dropped the sack, ran to her side, and dropped to his knees in the ash. "You," he started, then stopped. Words seemed too small. His storm-gray eyes held hers, full of something unspoken and immense. "We'll need to move them," Ruth said quickly, nodding toward the mare and her foal. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her voice was firm. "If the wind shifts, they'll be lost." Jonah nodded, and together they half-dragged, half-led the staggering pair into the barn's lee. The foal stumbled, found its legs, and pressed against its mother's side. Ruth's heart clenched tight, as if it had grown too big for her chest. Hours passed in a blur of smoke and labor. When at last the flames broke and turned aside, leaving only blackened ground at the edges of the wash, Jonah staggered to the porch rail and sank onto the steps. Ruth stood a moment, swaying, then walked to him. Her hair hung damp, streaked with soot, her hands blistered and raw. She sank down beside him, silent. The sky was strange, bruised purple and gold, a tired rainbow fading where storm clouds broke, apart. The foal nickered in the barn, a thin cry that sounded impossibly like hope. Jonah finally spoke, voice low. "You saved them." Ruth turned her head. "We saved all of it, the house, the stock, the land." She hesitated, then added, "I saved myself too." He looked at her then. Not as a man looks at someone rescued or pitied, but as a man looks at an equal, a partner carved out of the same fire. His hand, rough and scarred, reached for hers. When his fingers closed over her palm, she did not flinch. They sat that way, side by side, as the prairie exhaled smoke and the cottonwood leaves whispered in tired applause. Ruth's notebook lay on the porch rail, ash dusted across its cover. She opened it, thumbed to a clean page, and wrote with slow, deliberate strokes. "Today, the barren ground gave birth." Jonah read over her shoulder. He smiled, a small, unpracticed thing, and laid his other hand gently over hers. "I thought I had nothing left to give," Ruth whispered. "Turns out I was wrong." Jonah's voice was almost a vow. "Turns out we both were." From the barn came the soft sound of the foal nudging at its mother, legs finding strength, life insisting on itself. Ruth closed her eyes, breathed the smoke-tinged air, and knew this moment would be the root of everything to come. When dawn finally spread across the land, the fire's scars showed black and ugly, but the garden still stood. Green shoots, defiantly, pushing toward the light. Ruth leaned on the porch rail, Jonah beside her, their shoulders almost touching. She had been bought for silver, sold as Barren, but in the ashes she had found something neither ledger nor man could take. Belonging. The foal stumbled from the barn into the rising sun, its coat gleaming like new copper. Ruth smiled, tears slipping free. Beside her, Jonah tipped his hat, his silence now a language she understood well, one of respect, devotion, and promise. Out there on the frontier, with fire still smoldering and ash under their boots, Ruth had found not just a place to live, but a life to claim. And as the wind carried the smell of fresh earth and survival, the story ended not with what she had lost, but with what she had chosen: courage, love, and the chance to grow where the world once called her barren. If Ruth's courage and Jonah's quiet devotion touched something quiet and true inside your soul, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Out here in the Wild West, love may be hard-won, but it's always worth the fight. Join us for more stories of grit, sacrifice, and hearts that endure against all odds.